We've all been there. We've all witnessed a movie that left us scratching our heads in disbelief. The peculiar thing is, someone at some time for some unexplainable reason thought making that film was a worthwhile idea. What were they thinking? One such movie was the 1965 black and white horror classic, The Yesterday Machine. I'm Old Man Kelly and I can't help myself. I need to know the story, the who's, the whens, and the whys. I'll warn you right off the bat that information on this film was sparse, but I'll give you what I was able to uncover. The Yesterday Machine is a very obscure, all but forgotten little independent from the Lone Star State which, as it turns out, deserves its obscurity, writes Brian Sen in his book, A Year of Fear, a day-by-day guide to 366 horror films. I strongly disagree. This film comes from the days of regional cinema, movies that were conceived, produced, and often distributed in certain areas of the US that were not part of Hollywood. Many times these films were made by people who really had no formal training or perhaps no knowledge at all of basic filmmaking. These films, I believe, should be watched by every film student because you learn more from mistakes than you do from successes. In the book Bombs Away, 50 Old, Often Bad, and Mostly Forgotten Films, in no particular order by John Vetto, he writes, "These were basically vanity projects made by people who wanted to see their name and those of their neighbors up in lights. They usually starred people you've never heard of, doing their best despite the fact that most were amateurs." I have a problem with that. Calling them vanity projects is wrong in most cases. From what I found, these films were made by people who had a love of film and just wanted to create their own. Also, as far as wanting to see their name up in lights, that's no different from most of the people in Hollywood, so what's John's point? Anyway, in Florida, for instance, there were regional films such as 1964's The Horror of Party Beach from Del Tenney or 1971's Zot from Don Barton. In Texas, you had The Killer Shrews from 1959, Manos, The Hands of Fate from 1966, and this film, The Yesterday Machine. The man responsible for this film was Russ Marker. Russ lived from 1926 to 2010. He was born in Tishomingo, Oklahoma. His real name was Monroe Ken Namer Jr. It was hard to find images of Russ. I found these two from a 1965 newspaper article, but you really don't see too much. I think that's him sitting next to Robert Clark from Beyond the Time Barrier in 1960, and I'm fairly confident that's him playing a bank guard in 1967's Bonnie and Clyde. Anyway, Russ's acting career wasn't going anywhere, so he started writing and directing. His first effort was in 1964 when he began making a film in Oklahoma and Texas that he wrote and directed called The Demon from Devil's Lake. The film was never completed. Visions of movie stardom for 15 volunteer actors in low-budget science fiction movie filmed in the Durant area were fading fast Wednesday after the producer of the movie was charged with issuing bogus checks. From there, Marker went to Dallas to make another film, one which he also wrote and directed. Yesterday Machine was based on an idea I got right after the Second World War. I was reading an article about all the secret weapons that the Germans had been working on. The war ended before they could use most of them, but they had some real amazing things. I got to thinking about these weapons in Germany and I thought, hell, that would be something to base a story on. And so that's kind of where I got the idea for Yesterday Machine. It kind of stayed with me, the memory of it, because I wrote that about a year after I read the article. I thought, what if they had a damn time machine? This mad scientist had built it in order to bring Hitler back to power and reestablish the Third Reich. That's why I wrote that. Russ was lucky to be friends with several millionaires like Dr. Dan Holloway, who became an executive producer on the film by investing money. He knew a lot of actors in Dallas and invited them for auditions. He picked those he liked, but for the lead he wanted a name, so he got Tim Holt to play Lieutenant Fred Partain. Tim was born Charles John Holt III on February 5, 1919 in Beverly Hills, California. He was the son of actor Jack Holt, who had been a leading man in Hollywood in the 1930s. Jr. had dreams of starring in westerns just like his dad. After schooling at the Culver Military Academy in Culver, Indiana, he went out to Hollywood. His career began in 1937 with the film Stella Dallas. He appeared in films from then on until the early 1950s. One of his most famous roles was with Humphrey Bogart and Walter Huston in John Huston's 1948 film The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Soon after, his career began to taper off. After starring in a series of westerns for Howard Hughes' RKO, his career came to an end. I came to California in 1947 with a rodeo, and that's where I met my wife. When the series finished, I headed back here for good. I never did like Hollywood that much. There was nothing magical about it for me. He began working in the building business and acted in one film in which he was the star, the low-budget The Monster That Challenged the World from 1957. In the early 1960s, he began working as an on-air personality for an Oklahoma radio station, KLPR. Russ Marker, who was from Oklahoma himself, went to talk to him one day and showed him the script. When he offered Tim the job, Tim said, "I'd love to. Nothing's happening up here. I can't get a job." So he moved down to Dallas and stayed there for 3 months until he got an offer in California, and then he left. The part of Jim Crandell, the newspaper reporter, was played by James Britton. James was actually Russ Marker's brother. He used Britton for his acting name, but as far as I can tell, this was his only film. Linda Jenkins plays the baton-twirling Margie DeMar. Linda was a 1961 graduate from Bryan Adams High School in Dallas, and that's all I can really find out about her except she appeared in a 1975 film called Loose Ends. Jay Ramsey, who plays her boyfriend Howie Ellison, was credited with a couple of soundtrack bits, but this was his only acting. The concerned sister Sandy was played by Anne Pellegrino. This was her only acting credit. And I bet you can guess where this is going. This was the only credit for most involved. That goes for Olga Powell, who plays Didi Yama, Bob Brown as Dr. Wilson D. Blake, Carol Gilly as Blonde Nurse, Robert Kelly as Detective Lansky, and Bill Thurman, who is credited as Detective. All of whom I would love to talk about, but there is just nothing. There were a few exceptions. The evil Nazi scientist, Professor Ernest von Hauser, is played by the scenery-chewing Jack Herman. Jack had a small film resume before this, having roles in the films Beyond the Time Barrier in 1960 and The Naked Witch and The Seventh Commandment, both from 1961. The Yesterday Machine would be his last film. Oddly, the most accomplished actor out of the group was that of Patrick Crenshaw, who played one of the Confederate soldiers. If I had to guess, I would say that was Patrick. Crenshaw lived from 1919 to 2005. His career began at the age of 16 playing a bartender in the 1955 film Texas Lady. It was an uncredited role, but his first credited role was in The Amazing Transparent Man from 1960. That led to 40 years and some 102 appearances in films like Bonnie and Clyde from 1967, Pee-wee's Big Adventure from 1985, The Hudsucker Proxy from 1994, Best in Show from 2000, and Old School from 2003. Now, very little is known about the production of this film, but I have to think it was done very quickly, and I guess it goes without saying that the budget was very small. I do know that the song Leave Me Alone, which Pellegrino sings on camera during the nightclub sequence, was written by Russ Marker himself.
Private cry, I'm coming down with the sorrows, 'cause I just told my baby goodbye.
Apparently there is a band in the film, or maybe a band that did music for the film, called The Expressions. About the only thing I found about the film's production was from the IMDb in the user comments from August of 2006. Someone calling himself Kelly Bob-4 claimed to be the man who played Detective Lansky, and he wrote, "I was honored to play Detective Lansky in the Yesterday Machine movie. Tim Holt was a true professional to put up with a bunch of local Dallas actors. And even though this is a typically bad science fiction movie, for the time, It's okay to watch. The reason why I'm writing this today is I just found my VHS copy of the movie and made a DVD for my own restoration and to have something to play for my grandkids. Actually, the quality of the DVD turned out pretty good, even though the VHS is quite old. I had a recording studio in Dallas, Texas at the time of the shooting of this movie, and most of the interior scenes were done in the back rooms of my studio, sets built for the dungeons and the time machine locations, etc. All the music was recorded at my studio with the Nick Nicholas Band doing the playing. All in all, it's a really good example of a bad sci-fi 1960s movie and worth the watch, if you can find a copy. I'm glad I have one, and now a DVD that will last for a few years more. Now it's true, Bob Kelly was a Dallas disc jockey at WRR and owned the Top 10 recording studio, and may have been a member of the Expressions, so I have no reason to think this wasn't written by the real Bob Kelly. So the story of the Yesterday Machine goes like this. A young high school couple are having car trouble. While Howie Ellison works on the auto, Margie DeMar practices her baton twirling. Eventually, Howie gives up and they decide to walk. Remembering a farmhouse they had just passed, they figure they might be able to get help there. But as they leave, they see a sign that reads, "Keep out."
I don't think we ought to go on that property.
Look, you want to get to the game, don't you?
Of course I do.
Come on.
Now, I might be crazy, but in Texas, if I see a sign that says "Keep out," I keep out. People in Texas have guns. Anyway, while they walk, we are treated to some bizarrely wonderful jazz music. The couple see a campfire and then a couple of men. We, the audience, don't see the men, but they don't sound friendly. They absolutely have guns.
Hey, Dad, what are you made up for? I mean, what's the bit? Hey, now, don't point that thing at us. It could go off.
Quick, don't let him get away!
Howie tackles one of the men to give Margie some time to run. We won't see her again for a while. Howie gets up and runs, but a shot rings out. He gets hit by a bullet, but that doesn't stop him, for a while, until he passes out on the road. What happened to Margie? We don't know. Cut to the big city. Newspaper reporter Jim Cardell is investigating the shooting. Talking to a Dr. Wilson D. Blake, he learns that Howie was shot by a Civil War-era musket.
You see, that's a mini ball. The kind of a bullet they used during the Civil War.
During a flashback, we now see the men that the couple ran into were two Civil War soldiers. What's going on?
Hey, Dad.
Marge's sister Sandy, a nightclub singer, has not yet heard that her sister is missing. In the club, we are treated to some swing dancing and a song by Sandy.
Go on away and leave me alone. I wanna be by my...
After the show, the police, including Lieutenant Fred Partain, let her know what's up. Outside the club, reporter Jim is waiting. They both go to where Margie disappeared, but they find nothing. Later, however, we are told that trekking dogs at the scene were confused, as if Margie had just disappeared.
The scent had stopped right in the middle of nowhere. It was as if the girl had just been snatched off the face of the earth into thin air.
Wait a minute. You mean no footprints, no tire tracks, no nothing?
Although they did find an authentic Confederate hat. After a quick meeting in Howie's hospital room in which he shows very little concern for Margie, Sandy and Jim decide to go back to the site of the disappearance, but this time in the daylight. At the farmhouse, strange things start happening. There's an attack and then a fight. They run, but then suddenly things change.
Well, this must be the wrong place. This isn't where we left it.
This is where we left it, all right.
Their car is gone. The road is no longer paved, and there's a fence where there wasn't a fence moments earlier. So many things are wrong, but after he gives Sandy a slap, Jim tells her,
It'll be all right. Everything's going to work out.
I wonder what led him to that conclusion. What could be happening? We're about to find out. Meet Professor Ernest von Hauser. He's going to explain everything, and I mean everything, in great detail. Literally 20 minutes of detail.
It has long been established that time and space do not exist except in relation to each other.
If you want to hear all the pseudoscientific mumblings of how time travel works, you'll have to watch the film yourself. But it can be summed up as, the professor has built a time machine and he plans to bring to the present Adolf Hitler.
Soon Hitler will return. We will rewrite history, and the Third Reich will endure.
He's already brought back a servant girl called Didiyama from 1,000 years in the past. So, okay, the time machine is working. What's holding up the Fuhrer? The sisters are reunited, although in a jail cell.
Margie, baby!
Sandy!
Honey, are you all right? Did they hurt you?
Oh, Sandy, I didn't think I'd ever see you again.
And eventually, Jim is added to another jail cell. When Margie is taken away for experiments, Jim begs Didiyama for help. Didiyama refuses, but when she's mistreated by a guard, she changes her mind. And then, as the jazz score continues in what looks like a potential rape scene,
Stay away from me.
this results in Didiyama's death. But oddly, when Sandy seems upset with her death, Jim says it's all right.
Oh, Jim, it was awful. He strangled her.
It's all right, honey. Try to get hold of yourself. We've got to get out of here.
I'll be fine.
Really, Jim? The girl who just helped you escape was brutally killed and it's all right? Anyway. They arrive at the lab just as Margie is being sent to the future. And what would any mad scientist's lab be without one of these things? Anyway, Jim's not having it, and he's got a gun.
You insane, sadistic. If you don't bring that girl back, I'll empty this gun into that warped brain of yours.
As Jim, Sandy, and Margie pop up from a secret underground door, they find that the police have arrived at the scene. We can only guess where the professor went, but Lieutenant Fred Partain makes sure no one will ever have the secret of time travel, at least for now.
Sooner or later, some other joker is going to invent a machine just like it. Maybe by then the world will be ready for it. God only knows we aren't now. Hydrogen bombs are enough for people to worry about. Yesterday should be left alone, because today the world has enough problems just trying to make sure we'll have it tomorrow.
Words of wisdom from our hero. What's wrong with this picture? Well, right away, the first scene doesn't work. I mean, I get it, they want to keep the fact that the two men the couple meet in the woods are Civil War soldiers a secret, but it really wasn't necessary. But a big problem is there's way too much tell without enough show. And we meet the Nazi scientist and see his time machine way too late in the film. The film is called The Yesterday Machine, so we need more of that. The Mad Doctor doesn't show up until 45 minutes into the film, and he's our villain. And if you cut out that lengthy explanation of how the time machine works, he's only in the film for 15 minutes, and most of that is him monologuing. And that's something that's important. Cut the whole explanation of how time travel works. There are 3 good reasons for this. First, it slows down the film. 2, it doesn't sound convincing. And 3, the audience doesn't need to know. Could you imagine a Doc Brown spending 10 minutes trying to explain how the flux capacitor works? It would stop the film dead. And another thing, he says he's building the machine to bring back Hitler. well then we better see Hitler.
What do you know in your stupid, petty little mind?
You could have easily had the detectives bust in just as Hitler was appearing. Maybe the detective could have shot the controls of the time machine just as we see the madman. Then you could have done something like in Star Trek the Motion Picture.
They're losing their pattern.
Oh no, they're forming.
What we got back didn't live long.
Von Hauser could have then pulled out a gun in anger, and that results in him being shot. But the biggest problem with this whole film is the characters are all flat. There's nothing to them. Besides the Mad Doctor, there's no conflict whatsoever between the characters. Nothing. So how would I have made this film better? What would have been more interesting is what happened to Margie.
Margie?
I think a scream of horror from her right before Howie falls on the ground would have been more dramatic. Maybe he could have turned in a panic and yelled, "Margie!" before he collapses. That would have been something. And I would have made that the whole central point of the film, Howie trying to rescue Margie. Maybe it could have been one of those stories in which he's blamed for her disappearance. "Where'd you hide the body, Howie?" the cops would say. "I didn't kill her," he responds. The sister Sandy should have at least been pissed at him. "I always knew you were no good," she would say. At least Sandy should have been upset at Howie for leaving Margie behind, thinking he just ran away like a coward when Margie was in trouble. "You ran, didn't you?" "No, I tried to go back to help." Then you could have had the reporter Jim being the one who figures things out and tries to clear Howie's name. How do you explain the Civil War musket ball? And having Dr. Wilson D. Blake telling Jim about the musket ball was lame. Maybe show the surgery and have a doctor's eyes go wide as he takes out a bullet and realizes what it is. Then cut to Lieutenant Partain saying, "What do you mean a Civil War musket ball? That's the craziest thing I've ever heard." And Howie should have told a story of what happened that night rather than having Dr. Blake tell Jim what Howie had told him. It could have been at the police station while he's being interrogated about her disappearance. "You don't get it," he yells as they drag him off to jail. "We've got to find Margie." And somehow he gets out, maybe somebody puts up bail or something, and he goes to try to find his girlfriend. What I'm basically saying is we need some conflict between the characters to give the audience something to hold on to, because the characters as they are now are just dull. Now what about the music? As far as the music, I'm torn. In a weird way, I find the jazz score charming. And sometimes it can be interesting to have an unusual score. But here, and this is just my opinion, it doesn't work. It's not so much the jazz score, but the jazz they choose to use doesn't fit the scenes. But there are some rockin' tunes. Another strange choice is to have this bit, which is similar to a bit they used later in the 1960s Batman show.
Yes.
Okay, this is a tough one. What's here worth watching? The baton twirling and the dancing in the club is fun, I guess. And there's this scene.
Jim, his clothing.
I know. Ours are just as strange to him, especially your short skirt. Where are we?
Witchcraft! Witchcraft! Ha!
It's similar to things that would be done in other later time travel films. So maybe if the acting was a little better. Yet there's something I really enjoy about these homemade films. And I like the time-traveling apparatus, lots of flashing lights. Hey, my apologies to anybody who worked on this film, or to any fans of this film, if there are any. I really like to think positively about the films I watch, but I'm having a bit of trouble with this one. In my opinion, the writer tried really hard to create clever, colorful dialogue, but it just came up flat and sometimes ridiculous.
Hello, blonde girl.
Why, James Crandall, what brings you here? Now, don't tell me. Let me guess. They sent you down for an egoectomy.
A what?
An egoectomy. They're going to cut out that big fat ego of...
Oh, that's funny.
Funny, funny.
I want to thank you all for watching. Take care.